Welcome to the Story Junction, where every tale begins with a spark. Here, we don't just tell stories, we bring them to life. So sit back, relax, and let the journey begin.
In the spring of 1867, a federal investigator named Charles
Story
Whitfield
Junction.
arrived at what should have been an abandoned cotton plantation near the Mississippi Delta. He'd been sent from the district office in Jackson to verify property dissolution records, routine administrative work, the kind that usually involved dusty ledgers and bored county clerks. Instead, what he found would consume the next 3 months of his life and haunt him until his death 30 years later. The property, officially designated as the Greenvale Estate, had been legally dissolved in the Federal Registry on January 3, 1866. According to the paperwork filed with the Freedmen's Bureau, all formerly enslaved people had been issued freedom papers, all labor contracts had been fulfilled, and the land had been prepared for public auction. The file was marked, closed, compliance verified. But when Whitfield rode down the long oak-lined approach to the main house, he saw smoke rising from dozens of chimneys. He heard the sounds of human activity, voices calling to one another, children playing, the rhythmic thunk of axes splitting wood. As he drew closer, he counted people working in fields that stretched toward the horizon, their movements synchronized in patterns that looked disturbingly familiar to anyone who'd seen plantation labor before the war. Whitfield had been doing this work for 2 years, traveling across Mississippi to verify that plantations were complying with federal emancipation requirements. He'd seen every variation of resistance: planters who'd fled and left their properties to collapse, planters who grudgingly paid minimal wages while treating workers with open contempt, planters who'd found creative loopholes in labor contracts. But he'd never seen this, a plantation operating at full capacity, with hundreds of people apparently living and working there, 2 years after it had been officially closed and its labor force supposedly freed. He spent that first day conducting a preliminary count: 347 people, men, women, children, elderly, all black, all living in the same cabins that had housed enslaved workers before the war, all subject to the authority of a white overseer who watched Whitfield with suspicious eyes. When Whitfield demanded to speak with whoever owned the property, he was brought to a man named Virgil Hayes, a name that appeared nowhere in the federal dissolution records. Hayes greeted him with elaborate courtesy, offered refreshments, and calmly explained that there had been administrative confusion regarding the property's status. "These people are free laborers under contract," Hayes said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Every single one has freedom papers. I can produce documentation for each individual if you'd like." Whitfield said he would very much like to see that documentation. Over the following week, as Whitfield interviewed workers and examined papers, he began to understand that something far more sophisticated than simple defiance of federal law was happening at Greenvale. The workers had freedom papers, documents that looked official, bore government stamps, and contained all the proper legal language. They had labor contracts that appeared, on surface examination, to be legitimate free labor agreements. They received wages, or at least Hayes's ledgers claimed they did. But when Whitfield spoke privately with the workers, he heard a different story. He heard about promises that evaporated like morning dew. He heard about debts that multiplied faster than wages could pay them down. He heard about people who'd left Greenvale and vanished completely, as if the earth had swallowed them. He heard fear in voices that should have been speaking with the confidence of free citizens. On his 9th day at Greenvale, Whitfield sent a telegram to his superiors in Jackson. The message was terse. "Urgent. Greenvale estate situation. Requires immediate investigation. Evidence of systematic fraud and possible kidnapping. Request federal marshals." The response came 2 days later. "Stand by for instructions." Whitfield never received those instructions. On his 12th night at Greenvale, while staying at a boarding house in nearby Greenville, he was attacked in his room. 3 men with covered faces beat him severely, broke his right hand, and delivered a message. "Go back to Jackson, forget Greenvale. There are things here you don't understand." Whitfield recovered enough to travel and returned to Jackson, where he filed a comprehensive report detailing everything he'd discovered. The report was 47 pages long, included witness testimony from 16 workers, and concluded with a recommendation for immediate federal intervention. The report was filed under pending review and locked in a cabinet. 3 weeks later, Whitfield was reassigned to administrative duties in the Jackson office, forbidden from further field investigations. When he protested, his supervisor, a man named Edmonds who'd served in the Union Army and claimed to support Reconstruction, told him flatly, "There are political considerations you're not aware of. The Greenvale matter is being handled at a higher level." It wasn't. Whitfield checked periodically over the following months, using what limited access he had. No marshals were sent to Greenvale. No further investigation was conducted. His report remained in that locked cabinet, accumulating dust. In November 1867, Whitfield resigned from federal service. He'd joined the Freedmen's Bureau, believing he could make a difference, that federal power would be used to enforce emancipation and protect freed people from exploitation. Greenvale taught him otherwise. The system wasn't broken. It was designed to fail. Years later, in 1894, during an interview with a historian researching Reconstruction, the elderly Whitfield spoke about Greenvale. "I've seen many injustices in my life," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "But what happened at that plantation was something different. It was slavery with a legal veneer. It was hope weaponized as a tool of control. And the most disturbing part? The people trapped there had the very documents that were supposed to guarantee their freedom. They had freedom papers, official government papers, and those papers meant absolutely nothing." The historian asked what had ultimately happened at Greenvale. Whitfield shook his head. "I don't know. My report disappeared from federal archives sometime in the 1870s. There's no official record that the investigation ever happened. As far as the government is concerned, Greenvale was closed in 1866. And everyone left. But I know what I saw. 347 people trapped in plain sight, holding worthless papers and waiting for a freedom that had been sold to the highest bidder. Before we continue with the full story of Greenvale, how it happened, why it happened, and what became of those 347 people, I need to ask you something. If you're fascinated by the forgotten stories of American history, the ones that authorities tried to bury, the ones that reveal uncomfortable truths about how power operates, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. These stories matter. They're not just history, they're patterns that repeat until we recognize them. And I want to know, what state are you watching from? Drop a comment below telling me your location. Because these events happened in communities just like yours, and their echoes are still with us. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Let's discover how hundreds of people could hold freedom papers and still never leave the plantation. To understand Greenvale, we need to travel back to the final months of the Civil War, when the Confederacy was collapsing and the entire social structure of the South was about to be torn apart and rebuilt. This is where our story truly begins. April 1865, the end of the war. The Greenvale estate occupied 1,700 acres of bottomland in Washington County, Mississippi, in the heart of the Delta region, some of the richest cotton-growing soil in the world. Before the war, the property had been valued at over $300,000. A fortune built on the labor of 412 enslaved people whose names appeared in ledgers as property, their monetary value calculated alongside livestock and equipment. The plantation had been in the Hayes family for 3 generations. Virgil Hayes's grandfather had purchased the land in 1802 when Mississippi was still a territory. His father had expanded it, buying adjacent properties and increasing the enslaved population. Virgil, 43 years old in 1865, had inherited everything when his father died in 1861, just months after Mississippi seceded from the Union. Unlike many planters who'd volunteered for Confederate service, Virgil Hayes never joined the Army. He claimed a medical exemption, a convenient heart condition that required him to avoid strenuous activity, but somehow never interfered with his management of the plantation. His neighbors whispered that he'd paid for the exemption, that his health was fine, that he simply valued property over patriotism. Hayes didn't care what they whispered. He stayed at Greenvale throughout the war, maintaining production even as the Confederacy crumbled around him. Hayes was not a typical planter. He'd been educated at the University of Pennsylvania, studying law and commerce, before returning to Mississippi to take over the family business. He read newspapers from New York and Philadelphia. He corresponded with businessmen in Boston. He understood that the war would end, that slavery would end, and that the planters who survived the transition would be those who adapted quickly and ruthlessly. So while other planters raged about the approaching Union Army, Hayes planned. The enslaved people of Greenvale knew something was changing long before official word arrived. In early 1865, as Sherman's armies carved through the South, news traveled along invisible networks, whispered conversations between properties, information passed from Union scouts to field workers, rumors that grew more concrete with each passing week. Freedom was coming. The question was, what would freedom look like? Among the 400-plus people at Greenvale, there were families who'd been there for 3 generations. Children who'd been born in those cabins, elders who'd known no other life. There was Jeremiah, 43 years old, who'd been field foreman for 20 years, trusted by Hayes to organize work crews and maintain productivity. There was Ruth, 51, who'd raised 3 children at Greenvale before they were sold away, who now worked in the main house kitchen and heard every conversation Hayes had with visitors. There was Samuel, 25, who'd taught himself to read by sneaking books from Hayes's library, who understood that education would be crucial in whatever came next. There was Flora, 38, who'd lost her husband to fever and her daughter to sale, who had a sister working on a neighboring plantation. There was Adelaide, who'd arrived at Greenvale only 5 years earlier, sold from a property in Louisiana, who still carried the faint hope that she might find her husband, who'd been sold to Alabama. These weren't abstract concepts of enslaved people. They were individuals with histories, relationships, dreams, and an acute understanding that the world was about to shift in ways they couldn't fully predict. When news of Lee's surrender reached Washington County in mid-April 1865, the reaction among white planters ranged from fury to despair. Some burned their cotton rather than let it be seized. Others fled to Texas or Mexico, abandoning properties entirely. A few, like Hayes, waited to see what would happen next. The enslaved people of Greenvale gathered in small groups after the day's work, speaking in low voices about what Lee's surrender meant. Would freedom be immediate? Would they be given land? Would former owners be forced to pay reparations? Nobody knew. The uncertainty was almost as difficult as the bondage itself. Hayes watched these conversations from the windows of the main house. He didn't try to stop them. Instead, he studied the dynamics, noting who spoke with authority, who others listened to, who might become leaders in whatever new system emerged. He was gathering information, preparing for the next phase. June 1865, the announcement. On June 15, 1865, Union soldiers arrived in Greenville, the county seat, and assembled the population in the town square. A captain read from a proclamation, slavery was abolished throughout the United States. All formerly enslaved people were now free. Freedom papers would be issued to anyone who requested them. The Freedmen's Bureau had been established to help facilitate the transition. The crowd of black faces listened with expressions ranging from joy to disbelief to caution. Some wept. Others stood silent, waiting to see what freedom would actually mean in practice. The soldiers stayed in Greenville for 3 days, setting up a temporary office to begin issuing documentation. Hundreds of people came from surrounding plantations, standing in lines that stretched for blocks, waiting to receive the papers that would legally confirm their new status. But the soldiers were overwhelmed. There weren't enough of them. They didn't have sufficient supplies. The bureaucratic process was chaotic. Many people were told to return later, that papers would be issued over the coming weeks and months. The soldiers distributed a few hundred certificates, then moved on to the next county, leaving behind promises and a skeleton staff at the Freedmen's Bureau office. At Greenvale, Hayes watched this unfold with cold calculation. He didn't prevent people from traveling to Greenville. He didn't rage or threaten. He simply observed, waited, and then made his move. The morning after the soldiers left, Hayes called a meeting. He had a large bell installed near the main house specifically for this purpose. When it rang, people knew to assemble. It was a sound they'd heard countless times before for roll call, for announcements, for punishments. The sound itself carried the weight of institutional control. Over 300 people gathered in the open area in front of the main house. Some had been to Greenville and received freedom papers. Most hadn't. The lines had been too long, the process too chaotic, and there was always the fear of leaving the property and not being allowed back to collect belongings or find family members who'd remained. Hayes stood on the front steps of the house, elevated above the crowd, his position reinforcing the hierarchy even as he prepared to speak about freedom. He wore a well-tailored suit despite the June heat. His expression was neutral, almost friendly. "You've heard the news," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "The war is over. The Confederacy is defeated. Slavery has been abolished. You are, according to federal law, free people." He paused, letting that sink in. Some people shifted uncomfortably. This was the man who'd owned them, controlled every aspect of their lives, profited from their labor. Now, he was calmly acknowledging their freedom. It felt wrong somehow. "I want to be clear about something," Hayes continued. "I respect the law. I accept the outcome of the war. I will not stand in the way of your freedom. Any person here who wishes to leave is absolutely free to do so. I will not stop you. I will not pursue you. Your freedom is real, and I acknowledge it." This was not what people had expected. They'd anticipated rage, threats, perhaps violence. Instead, Hayes was offering something that sounded almost like capitulation. But those who knew him best, Ruth, Jeremiah, a few others who'd observed his patterns over years, felt a warning tingle. Hayes never did anything without calculation. "However," Hayes said, and there it was, the qualifier they'd been waiting for. "I want to talk to you about what freedom actually means in practical terms. Because freedom without resources is not really freedom at all." He painted a picture of the world beyond Greenvale, and every word he spoke was technically true. He talked about the towns where freed people were being turned away from jobs because white workers refused to work alongside them. He described the violence erupting in cities where racial tensions were exploding. He mentioned the reports of freed families starving on roadsides, turned away from towns, unable to find shelter or work. He noted that land ownership was being contested, that northern speculators were buying up property, that the Freedmen's Bureau was understaffed and overwhelmed. Every point was accurate. The post-war South was chaotic and dangerous. Freedom had been declared, but the infrastructure to support it was minimal. Many freed people were indeed facing desperate circumstances. "I'm not telling you this to scare you," Hayes said, his tone almost paternal. "I'm telling you this because I want you to make informed decisions. You're free. But freedom requires planning. It requires resources. It requires knowing where you're going and what you'll do when you get there." He let that settle, watching faces in the crowd. Some people nodded slowly. Others looked uncertain. A few, like Samuel, remained skeptical, arms crossed, waiting for the real message. "Here's what I'm proposing," Hayes said. "I'm offering contracts for free labor. You stay here, work the land, and receive wages. $10 per month. That's fair market rate for agricultural work. I'll provide housing, food, and medical care as part of the arrangement. At the end of the harvest season, you'll receive a share of the cotton profits. Within a year, maybe 2, you'll have accumulated enough money to leave with real resources. You'll be able to buy land, start businesses, support your families. You'll leave Greenvale not as desperate refugees, but as people with means." He gestured to the property around them. "This land has been your home. These cabins have housed your families. You know this work. You know me. Yes, you were enslaved here, and that was wrong. The law has recognized that. But this can be a bridge to your future. Use what you know, earn what you can, and then leave when you're truly ready. It was a masterful speech. Hayes had acknowledged the moral wrong of slavery while positioning himself as a pragmatic helper. He'd described real dangers while offering a solution. He'd framed continued labor at Greenvale not as subjugation but as strategic planning. Jeremiah raised his hand. Hayes nodded to him. "What about the freedom papers?" Jeremiah asked. "The soldiers said we need official documentation." "Absolutely," Hayes replied, "and you'll get them. I've already made arrangements with the county clerk's office. A certified clerk will come here next week to issue proper freedom papers to everyone. You'll have official federal documentation of your status. And those of you who choose to accept my labor contracts will have both your freedom papers and your employment contracts. Everything legal, everything documented." A woman named Dinah spoke up. "What if we want to leave before the year is done?" Hayes's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened slightly. "The contracts will be for a full term, 1 year. That's standard for labor agreements. If you break the contract early, you forfeit accumulated wages. That's not me being cruel. That's how contracts work. Employers need reliability. But I'll also include a provision. If you complete your contract term, I'll write you a letter of reference. That letter will be valuable when you look for work elsewhere. It'll show that you're reliable, skilled, hard-worthy." Another voice. "What about our families? Some of us have kin on other properties." "You're free to visit on Sundays," Hayes said. "That's your rest day. As long as you're back for Monday work, your personal time is your own." The offer sounded reasonable, suspiciously reasonable. But the alternative, walking away with nothing, heading into an uncertain and hostile world, was terrifying. Hayes gave them 3 days to decide. "Talk among yourselves. Think carefully. I want people who choose to be here, not people who feel forced. And for those who decide to leave immediately, I respect that choice. I'll provide a week's worth of food rations as a departure gift. That's more than I'm legally required to do, but I believe it's the right thing." Over the next 3 days, the people of Greenvale engaged in the most important conversations of their lives. Families gathered in cabins after dark, debating. Some argued for leaving immediately. Freedom meant nothing if you didn't take it. Others advocated for Hayes's plan: accumulate resources, then leave with leverage. A few suspected a trap, but couldn't articulate exactly what the trap was. Ruth spoke with a group of older women, those who'd seen decades of life at Greenvale. "He's never done anything that didn't benefit him," she said quietly. "Never. Not once. If he's offering this, there's something in it for him that we're not seeing." "But what choice do we have?" Another woman replied. "I'm 61 years old. I can't walk 100 miles to Memphis. I can't start over with nothing. At least here I know where the next meal comes from." Samuel gathered younger men and women, those who dreamed of freedom their entire lives. "This is the moment," he urged. "We might never get another chance. If we stay, we're choosing to remain here. Maybe the world outside is hard, but at least it's ours." But others countered. "Hard? People are dying out there, starving, being attacked. At least here we're alive." Jeremiah, who'd held authority as field foreman, found himself paralyzed by the decision. He'd spent 20 years following Hayes's orders, maintaining discipline, keeping production efficient. He'd been given slightly better food, a slightly larger cabin, small privileges that created a buffer between him and other workers. Now that buffer felt like a chain. If he left, he'd be just another freed black man with no status, no connections, no resources. If he stayed, he'd be, what? Still following Hayes's orders, but for wages this time. Flora thought about her sister on a neighboring plantation. If she left Greenvale, she could try to find her, maybe travel together to wherever freed people were gathering. But her sister might have already left. They might miss each other completely. At least if Flora stayed put, her sister would know where to find her. These were the calculations of people trying to navigate freedom with incomplete information, limited resources, and the trauma of a lifetime of bondage affecting every decision. Late June 1865. The paperwork. On the morning of June 22nd, a wagon arrived at Greenvale carrying a thin man in his 50s, wearing clerk's clothing and carrying an official-looking leather satchel. His name was Porter, and he introduced himself as a deputy clerk from the Washington County Administrative Office. Hayes greeted him warmly, and they disappeared into the main house for 20 minutes. When they emerged, Porter was carrying a large stamp, several ink pads, and a stack of blank certificate forms. A table was set up on the front porch of the main house. Porter sat behind it, arranged his materials with bureaucratic precision, and Hayes rang the bell. "Everyone who wants freedom papers, form a line," Hayes announced. "This is official federal documentation. Mr. Porter is certified to issue these certificates. You'll be called up individually." The line formed quickly. Over 300 people, waiting for the moment that would legally confirm their liberation. The process was slow. Porter asked each person their name, confirmed their age and physical description, filled out the certificate in careful handwriting, applied the official stamp with a satisfying thunk, and handed over the document. When Ruth's turn came, she stood before the table with her heart hammering. Porter looked up at her with tired eyes. "Name?" "Ruth," she said, then hesitated. She'd never had a surname. She thought about the word that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. "Ruth Freeman." Porter wrote it down. "Age?" 51, best I can figure. He asked a few more questions. Place of birth, previous owner's name, any distinguishing marks. Then he completed the certificate, pressed the stamp onto the paper with that authoritative thunk, and handed it to Ruth. She held the paper with trembling hands. It was thick, official-looking parchment. At the top, printed in formal typography, "United States of America, Certificate of Freedom." Below that, her new name written in elegant script, Ruth Freeman. The date, June 22nd, 1865. And at the bottom, a circular stamp that read, "Washington County, Mississippi, Office of Records, Certified." Ruth couldn't read all the words, but she recognized her name. She saw the stamp. It looked real. It felt real. This was supposedly the document that proved she was no longer property, that she was a citizen, that she was free. She returned to her cabin and hid the certificate in a tin box she kept under her bed, the most valuable thing she'd ever owned. The process continued for 2 days. By the end, 318 people had received freedom papers. Every certificate looked identical. Same heavy parchment, same printed header, same official stamp. They looked exactly like the legitimate freedom papers that had been issued in Greenville by the Union soldiers. Because Porter had been present in Greenville during those 3 days. He'd watched the process, he'd studied the certificates, and he'd noted every detail needed to create convincing forgeries. Porter wasn't a deputy county clerk. He was a forger who'd operated in New Orleans before the war, specializing in property deeds and legal documents. When the Confederacy collapsed, he'd moved to Mississippi where chaos created opportunity. Hayes had found him through a network of businessmen who understood that the post-war period would require certain flexible services. The stamps were real. Porter had acquired them from a corrupt county official who sold access to government seals for the right price. The parchment was real, purchased from the same supplier who provided materials to the Greenville office. The printed headers were real. Porter had access to a printing press in Natchez. The only thing false was the authority behind them. These certificates had never been registered with federal offices. They existed in no official database. They were props, elaborate theater designed to create the illusion of legitimacy. But the people who received them had no way of knowing that. They'd never seen real freedom papers up close. They had no experience with federal bureaucracy. The documents looked official, felt official, and came with Hayes's assurance that they were proper and legal. The contracts immediately after receiving their freedom papers, people were offered a second document. The labor contract. Hayes had prepared these carefully, working from templates used by other planters, but adding his own sophisticated modifications. The contracts were 4 pages of dense legal language, written in terminology that few people could fully parse, even if they could read. The basic structure seemed straightforward. 1 year of employment, $10 per month in wages, housing and food provided, a share of cotton profits at harvest. But buried in the dense paragraphs were clauses that fundamentally altered the agreement. Section 4, paragraph B stated that wages would be paid at the end of the contract term, not monthly. This meant workers would see no actual money for an entire year, making it impossible to accumulate funds to leave early. Section 6, paragraph A, established that housing was provided at a monthly rate of $3, deducted from wages. Food was provided at $4 per month, also deducted. Medical care was available at cost, deducted from wages. Tools were rented at 50 cents per month, deducted from wages. By the time all deductions were calculated, the actual net monthly earning was closer to $2.50, not $10. But the contract presented the $10 figure prominently at the top, while the deductions were scattered throughout the document in ways that made total calculation difficult. Section 9, paragraph C was particularly insidious. It stated that if a worker left before completing the contract term, they forfeited all accumulated wages and would be reported to the Freedmen's Bureau as an unreliable laborer with abandoned contractual obligations. This notation would be recorded in bureau files, potentially affecting the person's ability to find work elsewhere. Section 12, paragraph A gave Hayes the authority to modify wage rates in response to market conditions and operational costs. This meant he could legally reduce the $10 monthly wage at any time, and workers would have no recourse. Section 15, paragraph D included a clause about debt. If a worker incurred expenses beyond their accumulated wages, they would be required to work additional time to pay off the debt before being released from contract obligations. Samuel stood at the contract table, trying to read through the document. He could read, but the legal language was deliberately obfuscated. He asked Hayes directly, "What happens if I want to leave before the year ends?" Hayes had anticipated this question. His answer was technically accurate. "You're free to leave anytime, Samuel. I can't stop you. You're not enslaved, but breaking the contract means forfeiting your wages. More importantly, I'd have to report the breach to the Freedmen's Bureau. That's required by law for contract disputes. The report would go on your employment record." "What employment record?" "The Bureau is establishing a national registry of freed workers and their employment history. It's meant to help people find work. But if your record shows you abandoned a contract, employers will see that. They'll think twice about hiring someone unreliable." This was a half-truth. The Freedmen's Bureau was indeed attempting to create employment records, but the system was rudimentary and inconsistently enforced. However, workers had no way of knowing that. The threat of a permanent mark on an official record was terrifying. Jeremiah studied the contract, comparing it to conversations he'd overheard among white business owners before the war. These deductions, $7.50 per month for housing and food, that seems high. Hayes nodded, as if agreeing. "It is high. I'm absorbing significant costs to maintain this operation. The cabins need repairs. Food prices have increased dramatically since the war. I'm not making much profit here, Jeremiah. I'm offering this arrangement because I believe it's the right thing to do, not because it's financially lucrative for me." Another half-truth. The cabins did need repairs, but Hayes had no intention of making them. Food prices had increased, but not nearly as much as he claimed. And his profit margin, once he'd calculated free labor with minimal actual wage payouts, would be substantial. By the end of June, 280 people had signed contracts. They'd each received their freedom papers, signed the labor agreements, and committed to 1 year at Greenvale. The others, 63 individuals and families, made the difficult choice to leave immediately. They packed their minimal belongings, took the week's rations Hayes provided, and began walking down the long dirt road that led away from Greenvale toward Greenville, toward the unknown, toward whatever freedom actually meant beyond the boundaries of the only place most of them had ever known. Hayes stood on his porch and watched them go. He made careful notes in his ledger. Names, approximate ages, which direction they'd walked, whether they were alone or in groups. Ruth watched from her cabin window as her friend Esther left, carrying a cloth bundle and holding her 6-year-old son's hand. They'd worked together in the main house kitchen for 15 years. Esther had decided that staying felt too much like choosing enslavement voluntarily. Ruth had decided that leaving felt too much like walking into an abyss. They'd hugged goodbye that morning, promising to find each other again someday. Ruth never saw Esther again. July 1865, the first month. The work began on July 1st. Hayes organized crews exactly as they'd been organized before, assigned the same fields, established the same routines. The only difference was that now, theoretically, workers were being compensated. The reality of day-to-day life at Greenvale didn't feel dramatically different from before. Workers still rose before dawn when the bell rang. They still assembled for roll call. They still worked the cotton fields under the brutal Delta sun, row after endless row, while white overseers watched and occasionally shouted orders. They still returned to their cabins exhausted after dark, ate simple meals, and collapsed into sleep. But there were small differences. Hayes allowed slightly longer breaks during the hottest part of the day. The food rations were marginally better than during the war. Workers were allowed to keep small personal gardens behind their cabins, and every 2 weeks, Hayes posted a notice listing each worker's accumulated wages. Those posted figures created a strange psychological effect. Workers would gather around the board, finding their names, seeing the numbers grow. Ruth Freeman, 1587. Samuel, 18s. 43. Jeremiah, 21-15. The numbers seemed real. They seemed to represent actual value accumulating. Workers began talking about what they'd do with their wages. Ruth wanted to buy fabric for a real dress. Samuel planned to purchase books. Jeremiah thought about saving enough to rent a small plot of land in town. These conversations created investment. Workers started thinking of themselves as wage earners, working toward goals, not as trapped individuals looking for escape. It was a subtle shift, but Hayes understood its power. People who believe they're accumulating something are less likely to walk away from it. But as July progressed, some workers began noticing inconsistencies. Dinah had been keeping her own count on a piece of paper hidden in her cabin. She'd marked each day worked, calculating her expected wages. According to her math, she should have earned $10 for July. But when she checked the posted figures in early August, her total showed only $6.33. She brought this to Ruth, who brought it to Samuel and Jeremiah. They gathered in Ruth's cabin one evening, speaking quietly. "He's modifying the numbers," Dinah said. "I know what I worked. I counted every day." Samuel frowned. "Are you accounting for the deductions? Housing, food, tools? Even with those, it doesn't match. He's adding extra deductions that aren't in the contract." Jeremiah shook his head slowly. "We need to see the contracts again. Compare what he's charging to what we agreed to." "The contracts are in his office," Ruth said. Locked away. They sat in frustrated silence. They suspected manipulation, but they had no proof, no way to verify, and no authority they could appeal to. The Freedmen's Bureau office in Greenville was supposed to handle labor disputes, but workers had heard stories about freed people going to the Bureau with complaints and being told that contracts were contracts, that disputes had to be proven with documentation, that hearsay wasn't sufficient evidence. As summer deepened, another concern emerged: the silence from those who'd left. Flora's sister had been among the 63 who'd departed in June. Flora had expected a letter, some word about where her sister had settled, whether she'd found work, whether she was safe. Weeks passed. Nothing arrived. Flora wasn't alone in this. Multiple workers had friends or family members who'd left, and not a single person had received any communication. No letters. No messages through travelers, no news at all. Flora raised this concern with Hayes directly one afternoon. "Mr. Hayes, have you heard anything from the folks who left? My sister was among them, and I'm worried." Hayes's expression was appropriately concerned. "I haven't heard anything, Flora, but that's not surprising. Most of those people were heading toward Memphis or further north. They're probably moving, trying to find work, dealing with their own challenges. I'm sure you'll hear eventually. But it's been over a month. The postal system is unreliable right now. The war disrupted everything. Letters get lost, delayed. Don't worry. I'm sure your sister is fine." His tone was reassuring, almost fatherly, but Flora left the conversation feeling uneasy. 63 people all leaving around the same time, all heading in similar directions, and not one had sent word back. It seemed statistically impossible. She shared her concerns with Samuel that evening. He'd been thinking the same thing. "Something's not right," he said quietly. "People don't just vanish. Even if the postal system is disrupted, someone would find a way to send word." "What are you thinking?" Flora asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "I'm thinking we need to find out what happened to them, and the only way to do that is to go to Greenville, ask around, see if anyone saw them pass through or knows where they went." "That's risky. If Hayes finds out, he can't stop us from visiting town on our day off. We're free, remember? We have the papers to prove it." Flora nodded slowly. "They'd do it next Sunday. Go to Greenville, ask questions, try to find any trace of the people who'd left Greenvale and disappeared into silence. Before we continue with what Samuel and Flora discovered in Greenville, I want to remind you that this channel exists to uncover stories like this. The hidden, the forgotten, the deliberately buried. If you're finding value in this investigation, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm to show this story to more people who need to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We're building a community that refuses to let these histories disappear. Now, let's return to Greenvale and the dark discoveries that were about to unfold. What Samuel and Flora were about to uncover would change everything, but they weren't the first to ask questions. Others had already begun investigating, and their discoveries had been met with consequences that everyone at Greenvale was about to learn. August 1865. The investigation begins. Samuel and Flora walked to Greenville on a humid Sunday morning in mid-August. The sun already brutal at 7 a.m. The distance was about 8 miles, a 2-hour walk through flat delta landscape, past other plantations where freed people were facing their own negotiations with former owners. They reached Greenville around 9 a.m. and headed straight for the area where most black residents lived, a collection of streets near the river where freed people had begun establishing a community. They started asking questions. "Have you seen a woman named Esther traveling with a young boy? She would have come through here in late June. We're looking for information about a group from Greenvale Plantation, about 60 people who left together. Did anyone see them? Is there a place where freed folks are gathering when they come through town looking for work?" They spent hours talking to people, describing the individuals who'd left Greenvale, and everywhere the response was the same. Nobody remembered seeing a large group from Greenvale passing through in June. A woman running a boarding house for freed people was particularly certain. "I remember every family that's come through here looking for shelter. I haven't seen 60 people from any single plantation all at once. That would have been noticeable. Where'd they go?" "That's what we're trying to find out," Samuel said. They visited the Freedmen's Bureau office, a small building near the courthouse staffed by a single exhausted clerk named Morrison. Samuel explained their concern. A large group of freed people had left Greenvale in June, and there'd been no word from any of them. Morrison checked his registry. "No one from Greenvale has registered here, but not everyone registers. Some people just pass straight through, heading for larger cities. 60 people with children? They'd need supplies, rest, information. They would have stopped somewhere." Morrison shrugged helplessly. "I process dozens of cases a day. People are moving everywhere. It's chaos. I'm sorry, but unless they registered here, I have no record of them." Samuel and Flora left the bureau office feeling more disturbed than when they'd arrived. They expanded their search, visiting the colored churches, asking shopkeepers, talking to anyone who might have seen something. One man, an elderly freed person named Augustus, who worked at the docks, offered a disturbing possibility. "I've heard stories about folks going missing on the roads. Patrollers, bounty hunters, groups of white men who don't accept that slavery's over. They catch freed people traveling, claim their runaways, take them back into custody. Nobody knows what happens after that." Samuel felt ice in his stomach. "You think that's what happened? I don't know what happened." "What?" "I'm just saying there are dangerous people out there who see freed black folks as property they can reclaim. You be careful walking back." The walk back to Greenvale was somber and tense. Samuel and Flora kept watching the road, alert for any signs of danger. They reached the plantation around dusk and found Hayes waiting for them at the main entrance, as if he'd known exactly where they'd been and when they'd return. "Productive day in town?" Hayes asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just visiting," Samuel said carefully. "I hope you're being cautious. The roads aren't safe. People have gone missing. I'm sure you've heard the stories. I'd hate for anything to happen to valued workers like yourselves." The words were phrased as concern, but the message was clear. You're being watched, your movements are noted, and there are consequences for asking too many questions. That night, Samuel lay in his cabin and stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. 63 people had left Greenvale. Not one had been seen in Greenville, the closest town and the most logical place to stop. Augustus had mentioned disappearances, patrollers, people being recaptured. But if that was what had happened, how did Hayes know? And more disturbingly, had Hayes been involved? The possibility seemed too monstrous to fully accept. But Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes's calm acceptance of workers leaving, his lack of anger or resistance, had been suspicious from the start. Men like Hayes didn't just let valuable labor walk away, not unless they had a plan to reclaim it. September 1865, growing paranoia. As summer turned to fall, the atmosphere at Greenvale grew increasingly tense. Workers noticed more surveillance. Hayes had hired 2 additional white men he called foremen, ostensibly to help manage the cotton harvest. But these men didn't work the fields. They patrolled the property with rifles, positioned themselves at strategic points, and watched. Hayes introduced new rules. Workers needed permission to leave the property, even on Sundays. The justification was safety. He claimed there'd been reports of violence against freed people on the roads, and he wanted to track who was going where to ensure everyone returned safely. But everyone understood what this actually meant. Freedom of movement was being restricted. Ruth became aware of how carefully Hayes was controlling information flow. Mail came through the main house. Hayes claimed he was sorting it for efficiency, but Ruth suspected he was screening it, intercepting any letters that might be coming from people who'd left. She tested this theory by asking Hayes if any letters had arrived for her. "I'm expecting word from a friend," she lied. Hayes checked his records with performative thoroughness. "Nothing yet, Ruth. But like I said, the postal system is unreliable. Give it time." Dinah continued tracking her wages independently and comparing them to Hayes's posted figures. By September, the discrepancy had grown. According to her calculations, she should have earned $37. Hayes's ledger showed $21.18. She shared this information with a growing circle of concerned workers. Samuel, Ruth, Jeremiah, Flora, and about a dozen others began meeting secretly in the woods beyond the cabins after dark, speaking in whispers about what they were observing. "He's systematically cheating us," Dinah said, showing her paper with careful tick marks representing days worked. "And we can't prove it," Jeremiah added. "His ledgers are legal documents. Our scraps of paper with marks on them, those mean nothing to authorities." "What about the contracts?" Samuel asked. "If we could get copies, see exactly what we agreed to, we'd at least know what we're supposed to be paid." "He'll never give us copies," Ruth said. "And we can't take them. That's theft. He'd have legal grounds to have us arrested." They sat in frustrated silence, trapped by a system that appeared legal on the surface but was rotten underneath. Flora brought up the question that haunted all of them. What happened to my sister, to Esther, to all 63 people who left? It's been 3 months. Someone should have sent word by now. Maybe they're afraid to, someone suggested. Maybe wherever they are, they can't write freely. Or maybe they can't write at all, Samuel said quietly, voicing the fear everyone shared but nobody wanted to articulate. A young woman named Margaret spoke up. She'd been at Greenvale for only 2 years, sold from a plantation in Alabama. There were stories in Alabama about planters who didn't accept emancipation. Men who would pay bounty hunters to recapture freed people, take them to remote properties where nobody would find them. Work camps deep in forests or swamps. People who went there never came back. You think that's what happened here? Jeremiah asked. I don't know. But I know men like Hayes don't give up power easily. And I know 63 people don't disappear without reason. The meeting disbanded with no clear plan, only growing dread. They were trapped in a web they could see but couldn't escape, and every day the web grew tighter. October 1865, medical extortion. In early October, a flu outbreak hit Greenvale. It started with children developing fevers, then spread to adults. Within a week, over 40 people were sick. Hayes brought in a doctor from Greenville, the same physician who'd treated Thomas for fever earlier. The doctor moved through the cabins, examining patients, distributing quinine and other medicines, providing treatment that undoubtedly saved lives. But 2 weeks later, when workers checked their wage postings, they discovered massive medical deductions. $5 for a doctor's visit, $3 for medicines, $2 for ongoing care. The costs varied, but almost everyone who'd been sick now owed substantial amounts. Thomas, who'd fully recovered, found his accumulated wages reduced from $43 to $18 due to medical charges. He went to Hayes's office, anger barely contained. I can't afford this. $25 for the flu? Hayes opened a file, showing itemized receipts written in the doctor's handwriting. The doctor charges what he charges, Thomas. I paid him on your behalf because you needed treatment. Would you have preferred I let you suffer without medical care? I didn't ask for treatment that cost more than 2 months' wages. The alternative was to travel to the colored hospital in Vicksburg, 40 miles away, while sick with flu. In your condition, you likely would have died on the journey. I made a decision to save your life. Now you're upset about the cost? Thomas felt the trap closing around him. Hayes had positioned the medical care as a gift, a life-saving intervention, while simultaneously using it as a tool to deepen financial obligation. How am I supposed to pay this off? You keep working. The debt is deducted over time. You're not being punished, Thomas. You're being helped. Thomas left the office feeling more trapped than ever. His freedom paper was hidden in his cabin, a worthless document that granted theoretical liberty, while practical liberty remained impossible. The medical crisis affected dozens of workers similarly. People who'd accumulated wages over 4 months suddenly found themselves deeply in debt, their earnings wiped out by medical expenses they'd never agreed to incur. Ruth realized this was part of the system. Hayes wasn't just exploiting their labor, he was manufacturing debt, creating financial obligations that would extend contract terms indefinitely. The 1-year contracts were an illusion. There would always be new expenses, new deductions, new reasons why workers couldn't leave. She shared this insight with Samuel. He's not planning to let anyone leave. Ever. The contracts are just paperwork to make it seem legal. Then we need to break the system, Samuel said. Find a way to expose what he's doing. How? We have no authority, no money for lawyers, no proof that would hold up in court. Then we get proof, somehow. But before they could formulate a plan, something happened that changed the entire situation. November 1865, the federal agent. In mid-November, a man arrived at Greenvale wearing a Union Army coat and carrying federal identification. His name was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, assigned to the Freedmen's Bureau Regional Office in Vicksburg. He'd received an anonymous letter describing conditions at Greenvale and requesting investigation. Samuel had sent that letter. He'd written it weeks earlier, documenting everything they'd observed. The falsified wage records, the excessive deductions, the disappeared workers, the restriction of movement. He'd given the letter to a traveling merchant who'd promised to mail it from Natchez, far enough away that Hayes wouldn't be able to trace it back to Greenvale. Now a federal agent was here. Hayes greeted Webb with elaborate Southern hospitality. "Lieutenant, welcome to Greenvale. I'm pleased to see the Freedmen's Bureau taking interest in our operation. I've nothing to hide. Everything here is legal and proper." Webb was 32 years old, a former schoolteacher from Ohio, who'd served in the Union Army and joined the Bureau because he believed in Reconstruction. He was idealistic but not naive. He'd seen enough exploitation across Mississippi to recognize patterns. "I've received a complaint," Webb said bluntly. "Allegations of fraudulent labor practices, falsified records, and possible illegal detention of workers." Hayes didn't flinch. "I welcome a thorough investigation. You'll find that every worker here is free, properly documented, and working under voluntary contracts. I can provide complete records." Webb spent 3 days at Greenvale. He set up a temporary office in an unused building and conducted interviews, speaking with workers individually. He reviewed contracts, examined Hayes's ledgers, and compared posted wages to contract terms. The workers faced a terrible dilemma. Webb represented federal authority, the possibility of justice. But he was also one man who would eventually leave, while Hayes was permanent. If they complained openly and Webb's investigation led nowhere, they'd face retaliation. Most workers gave careful, vague answers when interviewed. "Are you here voluntarily?" "Yes, sir." "Are you being paid fairly?" "Mr. Hayes pays what he pays." "Have you experienced any coercion or threats?" "No, sir." Webb could sense the fear beneath their words, but fear alone wasn't evidence. Then he interviewed Samuel. Samuel had spent days deciding whether to speak openly. It was a massive risk, but if he didn't, nothing would change. When Webb asked if there were any concerns about working conditions, Samuel made his choice. He spoke quickly, voice low, aware that Hayes might learn of this conversation. He described the wage discrepancies, the excessive medical charges, the workers who'd left and vanished. He talked about Hayes's surveillance, the restricted movement, the sense that despite holding freedom papers, they were still trapped. Webb took careful notes. "Do you have documentary evidence? Records that contradict Hayes's ledgers?" "Only our word. His records show what he wants them to show." "What about the people who left? Do you have names?" Samuel listed as many as he could remember. 63 people. Webb wrote down every name. "Are you willing to make an official complaint?" Webb asked. "For me to take legal action, I need someone willing to testify under oath." Samuel hesitated. An official complaint would put his name on record. If Webb's investigation failed, Samuel would be marked as a troublemaker, making him a target. "Can you protect us?" Samuel asked. "If we testify and then you leave, what happens to us?" Webb wanted to say yes, wanted to promise federal protection, but he was honest enough to admit the truth. "I'll do everything in my power. But the Bureau is understaffed. We're stretched thin across 6 states. I can investigate, file reports, recommend action, but enforcement—" He trailed off, and Samuel understood. "So we'd be on our own." "Not entirely. If I find evidence of illegal practices, I can refer the case to federal prosecutors. Hayes could face criminal charges. And how long would that take? Months. Maybe a year." Samuel made a decision. "I'll give you everything I know, names, dates, discrepancies, but I need you to understand. If this goes nowhere, we're the ones who'll pay the price." "I understand." That evening, Webb confronted Hayes directly, laying out the allegations. Hayes remained utterly calm, responding to each point with practiced composure. "Wage discrepancies? Lieutenant, these people don't understand accounting. They see gross wages and don't comprehend deductions. Every expense is legitimate. Housing, food, medical care, tools. I'm providing services they couldn't afford independently. Excessive medical charges. I use a licensed physician. He sets his rates. Would you prefer I let people die to save money? Disappeared workers. 63 people left of their own free will. I have no authority over them once they leave my property. I don't track people. That would be inappropriate. They're free. Restricted movement. I've advised workers about safety concerns on the roads. There have been incidents of violence, but I can't force anyone to stay. They're free to leave any time. It was a masterclass in plausible deniability. Every answer sounded reasonable. Every practice had a justification. Hayes never admitted exploitation. He framed everything as paternalistic care for people who needed structure and guidance. Webb pressed harder. I'd like to examine the original freedom papers you issued. For the first time, Hayes's composure showed a hairline crack. The papers were issued by Mr. Porter, a certified clerk from the county office. I kept duplicate copies for my records, but the originals were given to the individuals. I'd like to see those duplicates, and I'll need to verify Mr. Porter's credentials with the county. Hayes led Webb to his office and produced a file box containing duplicate certificates. Webb examined them meticulously. He'd seen hundreds of authentic freedom papers. These looked almost perfect. Same format, same language, same stamps. But there were subtle inconsistencies. The paper quality varied. The stamp ink showed slightly different shades. The printing quality wasn't quite uniform. Webb had suspicions, but suspicions weren't proof. He made notes to verify Porter's credentials, to check whether these certificates had been registered with federal offices, to compare them to legitimate documents. Where did Porter acquire the official stamps? Webb asked. From the county clerk's office, as far as I know. You'd need to ask him directly. I'll do that. Where can I find him? He travels between counties. I'm not sure where he is currently. Convenient, Webb thought. He made a note to locate Porter and interview him. Over the next day, Webb continued his investigation. He interviewed more workers, cross-referenced Hayes's ledgers with contract terms, and documented everything meticulously. He could see the system. Contracts designed to create perpetual debt, wages calculated to always fall short, freedom papers that might be fraudulent, and an environment of controlled fear. But seeing a system and proving illegal activity were different things. Hayes had been careful to create a legal appearance. The contracts were technically valid. The deductions, while excessive, weren't explicitly illegal. The freedom papers looked authentic, and without access to federal registries, Webb couldn't immediately prove they were forgeries. On his final morning at Greenvale, Webb spoke with Samuel privately. I'm filing a comprehensive report recommending a full federal investigation. I'll recommend that federal marshals be sent here, that Hayes's records be seized and forensically examined, and that the freedom papers be verified against official registries. How long will that take? I don't know, but I want you to know. I believe you. I can see what's happening here, and I'm going to do everything I can to stop it. Samuel wanted to believe him. Webb seemed genuine, committed, idealistic. But Samuel had learned that idealism often collapsed under institutional indifference. Webb left Greenvale that afternoon, carrying a file of notes and testimony. He promised to send word about the investigation's progress. That word never came. 3 weeks after Webb's visit, a notice appeared on the board outside Hayes's office. It stated that Lieutenant Marcus Webb had been reassigned to duties in Texas and was no longer serving Mississippi. All ongoing investigations under his supervision had been transferred to a new officer who would review cases in order of priority based on available resources. Samuel read the notice and felt his last thread of hope snap. There would be no investigation, no federal marshals, no verification of freedom papers. Webb had been neutralized, whether through bureaucratic reassignment or something more sinister, it didn't matter. The result was the same. They were alone. What happened to Lieutenant Webb? Was his reassignment legitimate? Or was he silenced because he'd gotten too close to the truth? These are questions we may never answer. But what happened next at Greenvale The harvest, the broken promises, and the final revelation. Those stories survived. But before we continue, I need you to do something. Share this video. Stories like this disappear when we stop telling them. Send this to someone who values truth over comfort. And leave a comment telling me, do you think Webb was reassigned naturally, or was it more sinister? Now let's continue with the harvest season that revealed the full scope of Hayes' betrayal. As autumn deepened into winter, the cotton harvest began. The moment when Hayes had promised workers would receive their share of profits. The moment when a year of labor would supposedly be rewarded. What actually happened would destroy what little trust remained and set in motion the events that would finally expose the Greenvale system. Late November, 1865. Harvest season. The cotton harvest was the most labor-intensive period of the year, requiring every available person working from dawn until well after dark. The fields had produced well despite the wartime disruptions. Good soil, adequate rain, and relentless labor had generated a substantial crop. Hayes had promised that workers would receive a share of cotton profits in addition to their regular wages. This promise had been a key selling point of the contracts, the incentive that had convinced many people to stay. Now, as thousands of pounds of cotton were picked, ginned, and prepared for market, workers began calculating what their shares might be. Cotton was selling for approximately 30 cents per pound in 1865. If Greenvale had produced 40,000 pounds, a conservative estimate that meant $12,000 in gross revenue, even after deducting operational costs, the profit should have been substantial. Workers did the math in their cabins at night. If 280 people split even a modest portion of the profits, each person might receive an additional $50 to $100, enough to finally leave, enough to start fresh somewhere else. Ruth dared to hope that perhaps she'd been wrong, that perhaps Hayes would honor this part of the agreement, that the year of labor would result in real compensation. December 1865, the reckoning. In mid-December, after the last of the cotton had been sold and shipped, Hayes called a meeting. Workers assembled in front of the main house, the same space where they'd first heard his offer 18 months earlier. Hayes stood on the porch with a stack of papers, the financial accounting. The cotton brought in $11,200, he announced. That's gross revenue. Now let me explain the expenses. He read through a detailed list. Costs for cotton gin operation, transportation to market, storage fees, equipment maintenance, property taxes, insurance, administrative overhead, and 100 other line items. By the time he'd finished, the operational costs totaled $9,800. That leaves a net profit of $1,400, Hayes said. According to the contracts, workers are entitled to a share of net profits after expenses. I'm distributing that amount proportionally based on each worker's contribution over the year. $1,400 divided among 280 people meant approximately $5 per person. The silence that followed was absolute. Workers stared at Hayes in disbelief. $5. After a year of labor, after working harvest hours that stretched 14 hours per day, after picking 40,000 pounds of cotton by hand, each person was receiving $5 as their share. Jeremiah found his voice first. $5? The cotton sold for $11,000. Gross revenue, Hayes repeated patiently. Not profit. Running a plantation is expensive. I've itemized every expense. It's all documented. You're welcome to review the accounting. But reviewing the accounting meant parsing financial documents that most workers couldn't read, verifying expenses they had no way to check, and challenging numbers that Hayes controlled completely. This isn't what we expected, Ruth said, her voice shaking. I understand your disappointment, Hayes replied, his tone sympathetic. It was a challenging year. Cotton prices weren't as high as projected. Costs exceeded initial estimates. But I've been fair in the distribution. Every worker is receiving their proportional share based on the actual profit. Thomas stepped forward. According to my count, I should have earned $120 in wages over the year. Your ledger shows $48, and now you're giving me $5 more. That's $53 total for a year of work. The difference is deductions, Thomas. Housing, food, medical care, tools, it's all itemized in your individual account. I can show you line by line. I don't believe your numbers. Hayes's expression hardened slightly. Are you calling me a liar? The question hung in the air. Dangerous. Thomas had no proof, only his certainty that the numbers didn't add up. But certainty without evidence meant nothing. I'm saying the numbers don't match what I expected, Thomas said carefully. Expectations and contractual reality are different things. I've fulfilled my obligations under the contracts. You've received fair compensation based on actual financial performance. Hayes then made his next move, the one he'd been planning all along. I'm offering new contracts for the coming year. Those who wish to stay can sign on for another term. Based on this year's performance, I'm adjusting terms slightly. $12 per month base wage with the same deduction structure. I'm confident next year's cotton crop will be stronger and profit shares will be higher. $12 per month sounded better than $10, but everyone understood the game now. The $12 would be eaten up by deductions, expenses would multiply mysteriously, and next year's profit share would evaporate just like this year's had. And yet, what choice did they have? Most workers had accumulated less than $50 over the entire year. $50 wasn't enough to relocate, buy land, establish a new life. Leave now, and they'd be starting over with almost nothing. Stay one more year, and maybe they'd accumulate enough to actually escape. It was a trap built on sunk cost fallacy. They'd already invested a year. Walking away meant accepting that the year had been wasted. Staying offered the illusion that the investment might eventually pay off. Over the following week, most workers signed new contracts. The alternative, leaving with $50 and no plan, was too terrifying. But Samuel refused. January 1866. Samuel's departure. Samuel had spent the year since emancipation learning everything he could about the new world emerging around them. He'd saved $28, despite Hayes's deductions. It wasn't much, but it was enough to try. On January 8, 1866, Samuel went to Hayes's office and informed him that he wouldn't be signing a new contract. I'm leaving, Mr. Hayes. My contract term is completed. I've fulfilled my obligations. Hayes didn't argue. His expression was almost sad. I'm sorry to hear that, Samuel. You're a good worker. Are you sure about this? The world outside can be harsh. I'm sure. Where will you go? North. Memphis, maybe. Hayes nodded slowly. Well, you're absolutely free to go. I wish you the best of luck. Stop by the office tomorrow morning. I'll have your final wage payment prepared and a letter of reference. That letter will be valuable when you look for work. Samuel was suspicious of Hayes's easy acceptance, but legally there was nothing Hayes could do to prevent him from leaving. The contract term was over. Samuel was free. The next morning, Samuel collected his $28 in actual currency, the first time he'd held that much money in his life. Hayes gave him the promised reference letter, written on official letterhead, praising Samuel's reliability and work ethic. Ruth, Jeremiah, Flora, and several others gathered to say goodbye. Ruth hugged him fiercely. Send word when you get where you're going. Let us know you're safe. I will, Samuel promised. He walked down the long dirt road away from Greenvale, his freedom paper and his money hidden securely on his person, the reference letter folded in his pocket. He didn't look back. Ruth watched from her cabin until he disappeared from view. Then she returned to her daily routine, wondering if she'd ever see Samuel again, if he'd be the one person who actually made it out and sent word back. Weeks passed, then months. No letter came from Samuel. The silence was crushing. Ruth tried to maintain hope. Maybe Samuel was still traveling, still settling, still trying to find a way to send a message. But as January turned to February, and February to March, the silence became impossible to interpret as anything other than ominous. 79 people had now left Greenvale since emancipation, 63 in June 1865. 16 more at various points over the following months. including Samuel. Not a single one had sent word back. The statistical impossibility of that silence finally convinced Ruth and the others of what they'd been afraid to fully accept. Something was happening to people who left Greenvale. Something terrible. March 1866. Adelaide's investigation. Adelaide, the woman who'd arrived at Greenvale in 1860 from Louisiana, had spent 6 years watching, learning, and surviving. She had a quality that Hayes hadn't fully appreciated. She was patient, methodical, and very, very observant. While others had reacted emotionally to the situation, Adelaide had been documenting. She couldn't write well, but she could count, and she could remember. She'd been tracking Hayes's movements, noting patterns, building a mental map of his activities. She'd noticed that every time a worker left Greenvale, Hayes made a trip to Greenville within the following week. He always went alone, always returned within a day, and always seemed slightly more relaxed afterward, as if he'd completed some important business. Adelaide began asking careful questions of people in Greenville during her Sunday visits. She cultivated a friendship with a stable worker there, a freedman named Daniel, who'd known her family in Louisiana. "Does Mr. Hayes from Greenvale come through here often?" she asked casually one Sunday. "Sure," Daniel replied. "Every few weeks, regular as clockwork. Always meets with the same man, county official named Dalton. They go into the back room of the courthouse for an hour or so, then Hayes leaves." "What do they talk about?" "No idea, but Dalton's got a reputation. Before the war, he handled all the legal paperwork for slave sales, bills of sale, property transfers, that kind of thing. Made good money doing it. Now he handles labor contracts and legal filings for planters. Word is he'll do just about any paperwork work for the right price, no questions asked." Adelaide felt pieces clicking together. Hayes and Dalton, regular meetings, legal paperwork. Every time someone left Greenvale, she shared this information with Ruth and Jeremiah. The three of them, along with a handful of others they trusted completely, began meeting in secret in the woods beyond the cabins. "He's doing something with those meetings," Adelaide said. "Something related to people leaving." "But what?" Ruth asked. "Even if Dalton's corrupt, what could they be doing?" Jeremiah had a dark theory. What if the Freedom Papers are fake? What if Porter wasn't a real clerk, and the papers he issued aren't legally valid? Then people who left thinking they were free. Ruth couldn't finish the thought. "Could be recaptured as runaways," Jeremiah completed. "Legally, if their papers aren't valid, they're still considered property. There are bounty hunters, patrollers, men who make money capturing freed people and returning them to bondage." It was almost too horrific to process. The Freedom Papers they'd received with such hope, the documents they'd believed guaranteed their liberation, might be sophisticated forgeries. And people who'd left Greenvale trusting in those papers might have been intercepted on the roads, their papers declared false and recaptured. Recaptured and taken where? Returned to Hayes, sold to other operations, vanished into labor camps where no federal authorities would ever find them. "We need proof," Adelaide said firmly. "We need to find those Freedom Papers, compare them to real ones, or we need to find the correspondence between Hayes and Dalton, something concrete. That means breaking into Hayes's office," Jeremiah said quietly. "If we're caught, he'll have us arrested, or worse." They sat in the darkness, contemplating an action that could either free them or destroy them completely.